It was barely sunrise when I heard the rumble of engines near my vineyard. At first, I assumed it was just one of the neighboring farms starting their morning work. Tractors, trucks, and all sorts of machinery were part of the usual countryside soundtrack. But the sound today was different, heavier, more deliberate. I stepped onto my porch, squinting against the rising sun, and realized with growing alarm that the rumble was coming straight from the rows of grapevines I planted 5 years ago. Two black SUVs, clearly marked with HOA security stickers, were crawling slowly between the neat lines of my vines. Behind them, a pair of uniformed officers marched as if they owned the land. My heart skipped a beat. These weren't just visitors. They were marching like an invading force. One officer was snapping photos with a large camera, crouching near the roots of the vines, while the other waved a clipboard, shouting at the top of his lungs, "You're in violation of HOA landscaping codes." This will not stand. I had to remind myself to breathe. My vineyard wasn't just outside their HOA. It wasn't even in the same township. Not even close. I walked down the gravel path, hands visible, trying to keep my tone calm. "Excuse me," I said firmly. "You are trespassing on private agricultural land. This is not your property, and you have no jurisdiction here." The officer with the clipboard looked me up and down, smirking as if he was immune to reason. "Sir, we are within our rights to inspect properties in the community," he barked. "There are strict rules regarding landscaping, tree height, vine spacing, and general property appearance. You are in violation, and you'll be fined." I blinked, fighting back a laugh. Venus Baching, tree height. I had spent years carefully planting and pruning each vine to maximize fruit quality. None of this had ever fallen under HOA rules because the HOA boundary line ended 200 yards from my property. I tried to reason with them. "You need to understand, my property is private. You have no authority here. If you proceed, you are committing trespass, and I will have to involve law enforcement." The other officer stepped forward, raising a hand as if to assert dominance. "Ignoring HOA regulations can result in serious penalties. You're being officially warned. If you refuse to comply, we will issue citations and force compliance through legal channels." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady despite the rising anger. "You think a fancy badge and uniform give you rights beyond your jurisdiction? This is farmland. These are crops. One wrong step, one uprooted vine, and you could cause tens of thousands of dollars in damage." At that moment, the officer with the camera crouched beside a young vine, snapping yet another photo. I walked over quickly and blocked his view. "Step off my property. Now." The tension in the air was almost physical. I could feel the sun climbing, the light glinting off the SUVs, the faint smell of early morning dew and crushed soil. The officers looked frustrated but stubborn. Their stance screamed entitlement, like they were used to getting their way. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "County Sheriff's Office," I said, dialing with deliberate calm, trying to mask my nerves. The officers noticed immediately and exchanged glances. The one with the clipboard waved his hands, his voice rising. "You don't need the sheriff. This is a community matter. You can't just call outside authorities." I ignored him. "Hello, yes. I need a deputy to respond immediately to a trespass situation at my vineyard. 2 people in HOA uniforms are currently on my private land, taking photos and threatening fines." I gave the address slowly and clearly, emphasizing every word. The officers hesitated now, sensing that my calmness was backed by real authority. One muttered, "This is ridiculous. We're only doing our job." I met his gaze without flinching. Doing your job does not include stepping on a property that isn't yours, taking pictures without permission, or threatening someone with fines beyond your jurisdiction. You're trespassing. I suggest you leave immediately before things get more complicated." There was a brief pause. The hum of the engines from the SUVs, the rustling of the leaves, and the faint chirping of morning birds filled the silence. For a second, it felt like time itself had frozen. I could see the frustration and confusion in their eyes. They hadn't expected to meet resistance, and certainly not someone willing to involve law enforcement. The camera officer fiddled with his equipment, looking for an excuse. The clipboard officer took a step back, muttering about community rules and neighborly expectations. I took the opportunity to slowly walk down the row of vines, my boots crunching on the gravel, making sure they understood that I was serious. Then, as if on cue, I heard the familiar rumble of a county sheriff's vehicle approaching from the main road. My pulse quickened, relief mingled with anticipation. The officers stiffened. They hadn't called for backup, and now real authority was literally rolling down the gravel lane that I kept my phone in my ear, quietly confirming the location with dispatch. Yes, the individuals are in black SUVs marked HOA security. Two officers in uniform, taking photos, threatening fines on private property. The sound of tires skidding slightly on loose gravel grew louder. The officers glanced at each other nervously. Their earlier confidence seemed to crumble with each passing second that I could feel the power shift. The quiet, meticulous care I'd poured into this vineyard over 5 years suddenly felt like armor. Each vine, each row, was a testament not just to farming, but to personal boundaries, to the principle that no one could casually stomp on private property without consequences. As the sheriff's truck turned into the driveway, lights flashing, but engine quiet. The officers suddenly looked small, out of place, like children caught in a schoolyard confrontation far beyond their grade. The air hung heavy with tension. My phone still pressed to my ear, I whispered the final details to dispatch. Yes, they are refusing to leave. And then, finally, the first sheriff's deputy appeared at the edge of the vineyard, stepping out with calm authority, scanning the scene with sharp eyes. The officers froze, their earlier aggression now replaced by an awkward uncertainty. I stayed where I was, hands at my sides, breathing slowly, feeling the morning sun warm my back, knowing the confrontation was about to escalate. But this time, I was not the one at risk. Within minutes, the familiar rumble of sheriff's SUV broke the tense silence. Dust swirled behind the vehicle as it rolled down my gravel driveway, tires crunching over the small stones, sending tiny pebbles scattering across the path. I could see the deputy behind the wheel, his posture calm but authoritative, scanning the vineyard with sharp, practiced eyes. The two HOA officers immediately straightened up, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning fog. They looked like school kids caught sneaking into the teacher's lounge, shuffling papers nervously in their hands. The camera officer fumbled with his equipment, while the clipboard officer waved a stack of maps and printed notices like they were badges of honor. The sheriff stepped out of the SUV, boots sinking slightly into the gravel, and adjusted his hat. His presence alone seemed to make the air heavier, more serious. He walked toward them with slow, deliberate steps, eyes narrowing as he assessed the scene. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "can I see your documentation?" Prideful smiles spread across the officers' faces. They passed over the papers as if they were presenting a solved case. Printed maps labeled HOA boundary extensions, neatly typed violation notices, and handwritten forms filled with check marks and official stamps. The clipboard officer even tapped a signature page with a smug grin. The sheriff flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing slowly, then looked at me and back again at the officers. His mouth opened slightly, paused, and then he spoke, each word deliberate, measured, and full of incredulity. "You do realize this entire property is outside your HOA by more than 2 miles." The words hung in the morning air like a thunderclap. For a moment, there was total silence. The birds stopped chirping. The wind held its breath. Even the faint hum of the SUVs seemed to pause. I could almost feel the satisfaction of that silence, the justice in the invisible line between authority and entitlement. The sheriff didn't pause long. He folded the papers back, his expression shifting to one of firm authority. "Not only are you trespassing," he said, his voice steady but commanding, "you are illegally attempting to enforce rules on land over which you have no jurisdiction. You understand that." The clipboard officer opened his mouth to argue, trying to defend the indefensible. "The community, we're expanding our boundaries. It's all part of expansion," the sheriff interrupted sharply, stepping closer. "Does not give you the right to march on a private farmland, harass the landowner, or take unauthorized photographs. Those are illegal actions. The camera officer paled, his fingers trembling slightly as he dropped his camera strap. The clipboard officer's confident smile dissolved into a tight-lipped grimace. They both glanced at each other, realizing that their careful plan, their assumed authority, had collapsed in an instant. The sheriff shifted his gaze back to me, giving a slight nod of reassurance. "Sir, I suggest you document anything they've done while I handle the paperwork. These actions could easily be construed as harassment or intimidation." I exhaled, feeling tension drain from my shoulders, though I stayed close to the rows of vines, keeping a watchful eye. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows over the meticulously pruned grapevines, highlighting the stark contrast between care and destruction. "Ownership and entitlement," one of the officers, desperate to salvage something, muttered. "We were only trying to protect the community's standards." The sheriff turned to him, his eyes cold and sharp. "Community standards do not include trespassing or threatening private citizens. You need to leave immediately before this escalates further." For a moment, the officers froze, caught between pride and reality, their earlier arrogance completely gone. Their faces were pale, and I could see beads of sweat forming along the back of the clipboard officer's neck. The camera officer silently gathered his equipment, casting nervous glances at the sheriff as they backed toward their SUVs. The sheriff kept a watchful eye, making sure they didn't attempt any last-minute defiance. He then gestured toward me. "I'll stay until they are completely off your property," he said, a quiet reassurance in his tone. "You have every right to protect your land." I nodded, grateful but still in disbelief. For years, I had imagined scenarios like this. Entitled outsiders, confrontations over boundaries, the thin line between arrogance and legality, but never in real life. Standing there, between the rows of my grapes, the morning sun glinting off leaves and the dust settling from the SUV tires, it all felt surreal. The confrontation had shifted. The real authority had arrived, and suddenly the power dynamics were clear. Entitlement versus the law, bluster versus justice. And yet, even as the HOA officers retreated, the tension lingered like a low hum, the story far from over. After giving them a stern warning, the sheriff motioned toward the black SUVs. "You are to leave immediately," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. The clipboard officer hesitated, glancing over at the vineyard as if hoping the rows of green would somehow intimidate him. But the sheriff didn't move an inch, his eyes sharp and unwavering. Finally, with forced composure, the officers backed toward their vehicles, muttering under their breath. Each step they took was measured, cautious, their earlier arrogance replaced by an awkward, embarrassed silence. The sheriff didn't stop there. He radioed dispatch, calling in county officials to file a formal trespassing report. "This is not just a minor incident," he said into his radio. "We have individuals representing a private association enforcing rules beyond their jurisdiction. I want a full report filed. The HOA board needs to be held accountable." His voice carried authority, but there was a hint of personal satisfaction, the kind that comes from correcting someone who thought they could bully their way through the LAWBY late morning. The story had spread like wildfire through the local community. Word travels fast in rural areas, especially when someone tries to wield authority where they have none. Neighbors called, texted, and stopped by, eager to hear firsthand what had happened. There were laughs, nods of approval, and sympathetic expressions as I recounted the morning's events. People here don't take kindly to bullies, and the HOA's power trip had become the town's entertainment for the day. A few hours later, my phone rang. It was the HOA president, her voice unusually meek. We need to resolve this misunderstanding," she said, her tone faltering under the weight of embarrassment. I didn't hesitate. I leaned against one of the vine rows, feeling the warmth of the sun and the cool breeze on my face, and responded evenly. "Next time you set foot on my property, bring a warrant. Otherwise, don't come at all." She paused, realizing there was no room for negotiation, no way to spin this into anything other than their own mistake. The call ended quietly, and I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and relief. Later, The formal complaints resulted in consequences that the HOA officers would not soon forget. The county fined the HOA board heavily, and a formal letter of apology was issued, something that landed like a public rebuke in a community that valued respect for both the law and property rights. For weeks, the gossip continued. Neighbors recounted the story, embellishing details just enough to make it entertaining without changing the truth. Each retelling reinforced a simple fact: power without jurisdiction is meaningless, and entitlement can backfire spectacularly. By the afternoon, peace returned to the vineyard. The rows of vines seemed untouched by chaos, their leaves rustling gently in the wind, almost as if celebrating their survival. Walking among them, I felt the sense of control and security that comes from defending something truly yours. No more unexpected visits. No more threats. Just sunlight, soil, and the quiet hum of a thriving vineyard. As the days passed, the HOA seemed to shrink back into its imaginary boundaries, finally understanding that not everyone bows to their authority. For me, the lesson was simple but profound. Sometimes, all it takes is knowing your rights, standing firm, and having the law on your side. And in a situation like this, having a sheriff who understands those rights can turn an intimidating confrontation into a clear demonstration of accountability. The vineyard thrived like never before. Grapes ripened under careful watch, and the quiet satisfaction of independence filled every row. And the HOA? They stayed far away, lingering only in rumors and whispered apologies. It was a reminder that truth, persistence, and the right support can protect what's yours, no matter how entitled someone else thinks they are at the end.